Listen and repeat. Sit. Can I sit here? Can I sit here? Do you want to sit next to me? Do you want to sit next to me? Sit down, please. Sit down, please. Let's sit and talk for a while. Let's sit and talk for a while. Sit quietly. Sit quietly. May I sit beside you? May I sit beside you? Sit wherever you like. Sit wherever you like. I don't like to sit for too long. I don't like to sit for too long. She sits by the window. She sits by the window. I sit quietly and read. I sit quietly and read. She sits across from me in class. She sits across from me in class. I sit at my desk every day. I sit at my desk every day. Why do you always sit in the back? Why do you always sit in the back? They sit by the lake every Sunday. They sit by the lake every Sunday. I sit and wait. I sit and wait. They sit in the back of the room. They sit in the back of the room. He sits and thinks. He sits and thinks. She sits and watches TV. She sits and watches TV. Can he sit with us? Can he sit with us? She sits in the front row every day. She sits in the front row every day. We sit at the table. We sit at the table. She sits at the cafe. She sits at the cafe. I often sit by the window and read. I often sit by the window and read. We sit together during the movie. We sit together during the movie. Do you sit comfortably? Do you sit comfortably? They like to sit in the shade. They like to sit in the shade. Does he sit still? Does he sit still? They sit and eat. They sit and eat. We sit at the park. We sit at the park. They sit on the grass. They sit on the grass. He sits alone at lunch. He sits alone at lunch. I prefer to sit by the door. I prefer to sit by the door. He doesn't like to sit in crowded places. He doesn't like to sit in crowded places. Why do they sit so far apart? Why do they sit so far apart? Can she sit in the front seat? Can she sit in the front seat? I sit for hours. I sit for hours. They sit for a while. They sit for a while. She sits on the chair. She sits on the chair. Do they sit in the front row? Do they sit in the front row? Where does he sit? Where does he sit? He always sits near the window. He always sits near the window. Where do we sit? Where do we sit? We sit in this room. We sit in this room. Where do you usually sit? Where do you usually sit? I sit on the bench. I sit on the bench. He sits in the garden every afternoon. He sits in the garden every afternoon. She sits alone during breaks. She sits alone during breaks. We sit on the carpet. We sit on the carpet. They sit over there. They sit over there. Do I need to sit there? Do I need to sit there?
Thanks for listening. See you later.